The global perspectives on Israel and Russia reveal a complex interplay of history, politics, and culture. Israel, often viewed through the lens of its ongoing conflict with Palestine, Lebanon, and Iran, garners strong support from Western nations, particularly the United States, due to shared democratic values and strategic interests. Meanwhile, Russia's stance is shaped by its historical ties to Arab nations and its desire to expand its influence in the Middle East. This dichotomy creates a fascinating tension in international relations. The justification for Israel's military actions, particularly in response to attacks from militant groups, often hinges on a combination of factors that reflect Western political, historical, and security perspectives. Here are some commonly cited reasons. Right to self-defense. Many Western nations assert that Israel has a sovereign right to defend itself against attacks. This is rooted in international law, particularly Article 51 of the UN Charter, which recognizes the right to self-defense against armed attacks. Security concerns. Israel faces ongoing threats from various militant groups, particularly Hamas in Gaza and Hezbollah in Lebanon. Western governments often view military actions against these groups as necessary to protect Israeli citizens from rocket attacks and other forms of violence. Historical context. The historical context of anti-Semitism, the Holocaust, and the establishment of Israel as a refuge for Jewish people after World War II influences Western perspectives on Israel's right to defend itself. This historical backdrop can lead to a more sympathetic view of Israel's actions. Terrorism. Many Western nations categorize groups like Hamas as terrorist organizations. This classification shapes policy responses and underscores a narrative that frames Israel's military operations as counter-terrorism efforts. Geopolitical alliances. Israel is seen as a key ally of the United States and other Western nations in a strategically important region. Support for Israel can be driven by geopolitical interests, including stability in the Middle East, countering Iranian influence, and fostering democratic values. Calls for restraint and proportionality. While Western governments often endorse Israel's right to act militarily, they may also call for restraint and proportionality to minimize civilian casualties. This reflects a nuanced approach that seeks to balance self-defense with humanitarian considerations. Media and public sentiment. Coverage of conflicts, including narratives around civilian casualties and humanitarian issues, influences public opinion. There is often a complex interplay between historical narratives, media reporting, and political rhetoric that shapes perceptions of justification. It's important to note that views on these justifications vary widely, and there are many criticisms of Israeli policies and military actions, including concerns about human rights violations and the impact on Palestinian civilians. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict remains a deeply polarizing issue, with strong opinions on both sides. The characterization of Russia as an aggressor and Israel as a nation acting in self-defense involves complex historical, political, and contextual factors. These perceptions are influenced by the specific circumstances of each situation, the nature of the conflicts, and international reactions. Here are some key points of comparison. Russia's global image is shaped by its assertive foreign policy and historical ties to various authoritarian regimes. Russia's military actions, particularly its annexation of Crimea in 2014 and its involvement in conflicts in eastern Ukraine and Syria, are often viewed as aggressive expansions of its influence and territory. These actions have been condemned by many countries and international organizations as violations of international law. Russia's interventions are often portrayed as breaches of the sovereignty of other nations. The annexation of Crimea, for instance, was deemed illegal by the majority of the international community, leading to sanctions against Russia. Russia's support for authoritarian governments, such as Bashar al-Assad in Syria, is seen as an attempt to maintain its influence in the region, and suppress movements for democracy, further contributing to perceptions of aggression. Analysts often view Russia's actions through the lens of reclaiming its sphere of influence and challenging Western dominance in global politics. This has led to increased tensions with NATO and other Western countries. While Israel is frequently framed as a beacon of democracy in the Middle East, Russia is often portrayed as a disruptor on the global stage, challenging Western hegemony. This dichotomy influences how each nation is perceived in international forums, with Israel receiving substantial backing in its conflicts, while Russia faces sanctions and isolation for its actions in Ukraine and elsewhere. Israel's military actions are often framed within the context of self-defense against threats from militant groups, such as Hamas and Hezbollah, which are designated as terrorist organizations by Israel and several Western nations. This right to self-defense is cited in legal and diplomatic discussions. The history of anti-Semitism, the Holocaust, and the establishment of Israel as a safe haven for Jewish people shapes perceptions of Israel's actions. Many view Israel's security concerns against the backdrop of its historical vulnerabilities. Israel's military operations are frequently responses to ongoing and immediate threats, including rocket attacks on civilians. This context affects international perceptions and often leads to calls for Israel's right to defend itself. While there are significant criticisms regarding civilian casualties and the humanitarian impact in Palestinian territories, Israel often argues that it tries to minimize civilian casualties through warnings and precision strikes. This is sometimes contrasted with the more indiscriminate nature of certain Russian military campaigns. The narratives surrounding both Russia and Israel are highly contested, with critics in each case pointing out the humanitarian impacts of military actions and the broader geopolitical implications. Critics of Israel argue about the occupation of Palestinian territories and human rights concerns, while critics of Russia focus on expansionism and repression. The international community's reactions also vary, with more unified opposition to Russia's actions, as seen in sanctions and condemnation from many nations, while responses to Israeli actions can be more mixed, sometimes supporting Israel's right to defend itself, while also criticizing specific tactics. The dynamics of each situation are shaped by historical context, power relations, and the geopolitical interests of various actors. While Russia is often labeled as an aggressor due to its military interventions and violations of sovereignty, Israel's actions are typically viewed through the lens of self-defense against ongoing threats, although this characterization is not universally accepted and remains a subject of intense debate. For the enthusiasts of international relations, understanding these perspectives is crucial. Israel's innovative tech sector and military prowess contrast sharply with Russia's energy dominance and geopolitical maneuvers. Both nations navigate a landscape marked by alliances, sanctions, and shifting public opinion. As we analyze these dynamics, we must consider how narratives are constructed and the impact of media on global perceptions. Ultimately, the relationship between Israel and Russia serves as a microcosm of broader geopolitical trends, illustrating the intricate dance of diplomacy in an interconnected world. The narratives surrounding these countries are not merely political. They reflect deeper cultural and ideological divides. Understanding this disparity is crucial for political analysts, as it shapes international relations and informs policy decisions that resonate far beyond their borders.